Welcome to the recorded lecture, Principles of Normal Development. The resources for this lecture come from your Solomon and O'Brien textbook, Chapter 6, the OT a Therapy Ed study guide by Fleming Castaldi, and there is information from the AOTA practice framework, domain, and process. What we do always has a purpose. And so, what's the purpose of this reading and what should be your takeaway? Well, you should understand the characteristics of typical development. You should be able to make a connection between typical development and areas of occupation and contexts. At the end of this reading and lecture, you should be able to describe the periods of development, some general principles of development, and explain the developmental sequence of skills. You may know this information from other coursework, but now we're going to apply it, and we're reviewing this information as foundational. Okay, we're going to build on this for the remainder of the semester. On this slide, I have some definitions or terminology for you to understand. It's important that we know what we're talking about when we're reading. And normal and typical development is per the masses. It's which development that occurs habitually or naturally. It's the norm. Development is the act or the process of maturing or acquiring skills. And development occurs in many different areas. If we think in our practice framework and process skills, we're going to think of development in social interaction, in motor skills, and in cognition. So, development. When we think of growth, all that is the maturation of a person. And we should be mindful that development and growth can be used interchangeably. So, typical development is the natural process of acquiring skills ranging from simple to complex. Here we're going to talk about the sequence of skill acquisition. And why do we care? Why do you, as an OTA student, care what the sequence is? Well, because you're going to be working with children who might not be typically developing, and it's good to know what the norm is. Why do we need to know the norm? Paired with parents' wishes and concerns and goals, we need to know if the child is going to be moving in the developmental progression that's expected. And skill acquisition impacts our occupational engagement and our performance. That should not come as a surprise. What's really cool to know is the sequence of skill acquisition is predictable. So we understand that developmental milestones help us and guide us. We know things like the CDC milestone tracker is another cool tool to help us with understanding a direction a child might move in. But what's more important for you is that you need to know and understand this and can use those resources as a reference. So, again, the sequence of skill acquisition is predictable, and we're going to look at that as we go on. But the rate of development varies. And why does it vary? Well, it could vary because of different environmental context or personal context. So each individual we work with, each child we work with is unique. The skill acquisition is predictable, but the rate of development is going to vary. And that is going to help guide our intervention.
contexts.
I've added this slide to the PowerPoint presentation. The textbook does a nice job of talking about the relationship between typical development and context, but I am bringing the language of the practice framework 4 here. And what's different in the practice framework 4 than from practice framework 3? They devise the context into just two areas, the environmental factors and the personal factors. And the personal factors are unique features. The environmental factors are aspects of physical, social, and attitudinal surroundings. In the textbook, we're going to look at the information that the textbook had too, because it helps us think it through, but it's more broken down than the new practice framework. But let's think of context. It's a broad construct. I just covered this. It's divided into environmental and personal factors. Context is specific to each client. So, where I live, uh, the social situations that I am in are very different than yours or our clients or the kids that we work with. So, we need to be mindful that the context can influence engagement in occupations. And we know, because on the former slide, we said that context can influence skill acquisition. Well, context will also influence engagement and participation in occupations. For example, a child may grow up in the city and have access to some really cool playgrounds and museums and public transportation and develop certain skills based on that. Another child could grow up in the country and have access to farm animals and um, lots of open land and maybe lakes, rivers, or streams. And they're going to develop different, this is going to influence their engagement and participation in occupations. And their occupations might even look a little bit different. So, do you see simply how context can influence engagement and participation in occupations? They affect access to occupations and satisfaction with performance. So, it depends where we live, who our social circle is, what kind of um, attitudes or judgments, values, and beliefs are supporting us or not supporting us. And then the personal factors of an individual include demographic type information, their socioeconomic status. So, context important. We are going to cover the context the way they're outlined in the text as well, but this is the current breakdown per the practice framework 4. It's important that we recognize as practitioners that contexts can influence skill acquisition. And if we look at the different contexts, the cultural context, customs, beliefs, activity patterns, and behavioral standards, we know that definitely shapes skill acquisition. So I'm going to give an example of a little boy that I worked with who came from a family whose grandparents didn't believe this boy should have to do anything. He he was like the little prince. As a result, at 10 years old, he couldn't tie his shoes, he couldn't do dressing skills. He had all the performance components necessary, but culturally, he wasn't exposed to these things. Physically, when we look at physical, we look at the non human aspect. So, an example the text gives a child who lives in a 2-story house will learn to ascend and descend stairs earlier than someone who lives in a single family house, most likely, or a 1-floor house. When we think of the social context, this was My father carried my daughter up and down the stairs all the time, and he used to play a game of it, and they both loved it. And guess what? She had some motor delays with stairs because he just loved carrying this little girl, didn't think that she should do all the stairs in a tenement house, was very protective of her. And as a result, she had gross motor and mobility issues with stairs because they were with her a lot and they carried her around a lot, and the textbook gives a similar example to that. I'm sure you can come up with, and I hope you do, as I'm going through these contexts, that you reflect upon your own experiences and see, articulate to yourself how the context can influence skill acquisition. Continue. Continuing on, um, personal can be the child's age, gender, socioeconomic status, and educational level. And what the text gives as an example is a 2-year-old boy from a rural community will have different goals and enjoy different activities than a 10-year-old girl from an inner city. When we think of temporal, we think of stage of life, time of year, duration of activities. And the example the text gives is toddlers experience the terrible twos and they might show defiant behavior. But at this stage of life, it's expected. Whereas if you're working with a 5-year-old child, you would not expect those same behaviors. And finally, the virtual context includes communication by computers and airways. Kids nowadays, I'm seeing kids under 2 years old who know how to swipe across a screen and change a screen. Um, when I was growing up, I didn't know how to do those things. And virtual communication has expanded the way people socialize and even some of their leisure activities. Again, context. Some kids might have access to iPads, cell phones, computers, and other kids may not. And this is going to impact the way a child acquires skills. Makes perfect sense, right? Now we're going to talk about different periods of development. And a period of development is a unit of time or an interval of time when a child will increase in size, develop in different skill areas. And your textbook breaks the periods of development down into 5 different areas. And the first period of development is gestation. And gestation begins at the development of the fetus in the mother's uterus and continues through birth. So, from conception to birth. And this period is also known as prenatal, so before birth, prenatal, and it's typically 40 weeks, but we know that can vary. The perinatal period is around the birthing time, it's around the birthing process, and that can vary for in duration for various purposes. And honestly, it's not the scope of this course. What we're doing is just outlining the periods of development. And postnatal is post birth. This is when the infant is able to be sustained without placental support. One of the things I want to share is, why do we talk about periods of development? Well, they give us those intervals, those timings. They help us frame to know when certain um, skills and abilities should be developing. We also know that at this time, many toxic chemicals or negative influences can impact development. The next period of development we're going to talk about is infancy. And infancy is from birth to about 18 months. This is a time of rapid development and growth, particularly in the sensory and motor skills. There's significant physical and emotional growth when by the time a child is 18 months, they are typically walking, talking, and performing self care tasks. They can eat from a spoon, drink from a cup, and they're really good at undressing um, by the time they're 18 months. But if you think about all the skills and development that occur in this time, it's phenomenal. And we will be covering this in a subsequent lecture. Early childhood is the next period of development we're going to talk about. And I want you to be mindful that there are two age groups in early childhood, and that's toddlers from 18 to 36 months, and then preschoolers or preschool children from 3 to 5 years. At this time, kids are trying to become increasingly independent. They're trying to establish a sense of individuality. They are building on the skills that they so rapidly developed. So, early childhood. And again, I'm going to ask you, why do we need to have these periods of development articulated? Well, because if we're going to be working with kids, we need something to, uh, a framework, something, a scaffold, something to hang our knowledge on. So when someone says early childhood, you can think, okay, this kid is either between 18 months or 5 years of age. Big span, right? Lots of development occurring. Well, if they're on the younger end, then maybe a toddler, if they're between 18 and 36 months, or a preschooler, 3 to 5. But it's all part of early childhood. Middle childhood, well, it's going to start after 5, so that means it begins at 6 and it lasts until puberty. And puberty begins it's beginning earlier and earlier, around 12 years in females and maybe 14 years in males. But this is not a steadfast rule. Remember, kids are going to develop in their own time. There's going to be a sequence of development, but puberty for some kids is earlier and for some kids it's later. Typically, it's earlier in females. Think about this. Between 6 years and 12 years of age, or 14 years of age, where are kids? They are mostly in school settings, in educational settings. There's a shift at this time from the parents being the end all and be all and major influence on their lives to their peers. Middle childhood. Hey, just a public service announcement. There are only 4 more slides in this PowerPoint. Here we are at adolescence, and adolescence is the period of physical and psychological development that accompanies the onset of puberty. What does that mean? After puberty starts. We know that puberty is a stage of maturation in which a person becomes physiologically capable of reproduction. Um, there's lots of hormonal changes that are a result of that. And when does adolescence end? With the onset of adulthood, which is usually 21 years of age. And what happens at this time? Individuals begin to function independent of their parents. So here we have talked about the periods of development, and we use these as reference points when working with children. Knowledge of the sequence of development within each period is used to guide our OT interventions. And having the knowledge of principles of normal development help us problem solve to identify what might be interfering with a child's ability or preventing them from engaging in meaningful activities. So, on the next slide, we're going to talk about principles of normal development. Just know we're going into much greater detail in this course with process skills and occupations in subsequent lectures. This is just an introductory lecture. Principles of normal development. These are foundational to what we do as occupational therapy practitioners because they help us solve problems related to skill acquisition and they help us design appropriate interventions. So, as has been mentioned before, normal development is sequential and predictable. But what can be different is the rate or the speed at which one gains the skill acquisition and the direction of acquisition, which could be vertical or horizontal. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So, development is different, it varies between all kids, but the bottom line is the sequence remains the same. One disclaimer, and this can be confusing, but we're just going to go with the general principle that normal development is sequential and predictable. In the theory of motor learning, they have discovered that from the motor learning perspective, that their development does not always follow the predicted sequence. However, for our general knowledge, our understanding, thinking developmentally, we're going to assume the proposition that normal development is sequential and predictable. So I just talked about vertical and horizontal development. And vertical development, we're going to talk about it twice. I'm going to talk about it here, and then I'll talk about it one more time down here, just so it's clear. Vertical development, and I'm reading from the text to be really clear, refers to achieving milestones within the same performance area. So, a gross motor area or a language area in just one area. So, the example the text gives, infants who are typically developing acquire head before trunk control. That's an example of vertical development because the area is motor control. Head and trunk control are important for them to sit independently. After children have those skills in motor, they would then develop the ability to roll and sit and creep and walk. So, vertical development is in one performance area. Horizontal development refers to more than one performance area. So, the example the textbook gives is the child may take a few steps, that's gross motor. They might poke something with their index finger, that's fine motor. They may follow simple directions, which is cognitive, and they might try to say words, which is language, and play games such as peekaboo, which is a social development. So why do we need to know this? Just because if someone says, well, horizontally, if we look at this child from a horizontal perspective, horizontal is going to be across areas, vertically is going to be in the same area. Okay, that's all that is. No, children can develop at different rates, right? Okay. The next point we're going to talk about is maturation and experience affect a child's development. That should be no surprise. The text defines maturation as an innate, natural process of growth and development, and experience as the result of interactions within the environment. So, what have we talked about before? We've talked about contexts and how that can affect skill development. So, experience can be related to the context. Maturation and experience influence the rate and the direction of normal development. And the text gives the example children develop improved hand skills over time as they gain better postural control and practice movement. Makes sense, right? They're building. As children mature, they sit for longer periods of time, they problem solve, and that supports hand skill development. So, in this area, we also need to consider the level of arousal, the ability to attend to a task. And we know that to learn, we need to be motivated and we need to be in the state that we can absorb the information. So the child must be aroused and motivated, but not overly aroused so that they can't attend to information. When we work with kids, we look to make sure that they're interested, they're attentive, and they're calm. Because what happens? If they're not, they can't absorb this information. We often, in this, to keep them interested and motivated, we're client centered, right? So we're going to use the child's interests to engage them in activities that promote their development. Children generally move when they're learning skills from exploration, which is they're just learning about it, to mastery, that they have success, to final achievement, that can they own this skill, they're well skilled. So the third point we're going to talk about is changes occur in the biologic, the physiologic, I meant psychologic. So changes occur in the biological, the psychological, and the social systems. That means we're dynamic. These systems are interacting all the time. They support one another in development. They're continually changing. So when we think of the biological system, we are thinking of functions and processes related to the internal body structures. When we are thinking of the psychological system, we are thinking in emotional and behavioral changes. And we think of the social system, we think of the context, the immediate environment, and society as a whole. So, again, we know that context can impact skill development, while so too can changes in the systems. I think that should make perfect sense to you. Now, on this last point, we're going to talk about it again, just to in these principles of normal development through a developmental lens. Development progresses in two directions: vertical and horizontal. Can you remember what that was? Vertical development is they're gaining skills in one performance area. Horizontal development is they're gaining skills in more than one performance area at the same time. So the text, let me look to see what the examples they give. So, for example, in the occupation of ADLs, children learn to eat with their fingers before they learn to eat with a spoon. As children learn to roll, then crawl, and finally walk, they are progressing vertically in gross performance areas, or in the area of occupation. So, vertical direction is within a specific performance area or a specific area of occupation. Horizontal development is in several different performance skill areas or occupations. I hope that makes sense. If not, reach out. Okay, only a couple more slides left. We are at 3 basic rules of motor development. 1, There's a cephalocaudal progression. That means from head to tail, that the baby learns to have control of head and neck muscles, and then their arms and hands, and then their trunk, and finally their legs. So they're moving from head to tail. These are their little legs. Motor development is occurring in this direction. Second, proximal to distal. So, proximal, when you think of proximal, you think, and we're thinking of the body, right? Think of the shoulders, think of the trunk, think of the hips. So, children develop control of structures closer to the body, so their shoulder, before the distal, the hand farther away. So, they develop proximal to distal. Make sense? That means they're going to develop, based on that, they're going to develop gross motor control to fine motor control. Children control large body movements before they refine their movements. And the example the textbook gives on this is children are able to catch a large ball using both arms and the body before they can catch a small tennis ball with one hand. That means they're using the larger arm muscles to catch an 8-inch ball. And when they catch the tennis ball, which is smaller, they're using wrist and hand muscles. So larger to smaller movements. These principles of development provide what? A framework, a scaffold for us to understand when we're working with individuals, when we're working with children, to help us problem solve and to help us design appropriate interventions. 3 basic rules: cephalocaudal, proximal distal, gross to fine. And I'm going to add here, to have mobility, when we start to talk about movement, you have to have stability. So what's our summary? Normal development is sequential and predictable. However, development varies at the rate and the progression. They're specific to individuals. Why do we need to know this? We help children achieve their developmental milestones, so we need to have a good foundational understanding about typical development. When we understand these principles of motor development or the general principles of normal development, they guide our intervention and our evaluation. Now that you've read this chapter, listened to this chapter, what should you be able to do? You should be able to tell me or you should be able to tell yourself and review for yourself what the principles of normal development are. How do contexts influence development? We talked quite a bit about this. What's the sequence of skill acquisition? Remember, they're impacted by context too. And could you describe the periods of development? I think, how many were there? Let's see. I think it started with gestation or prenatal. And it ended up in adolescence. So what are the points in between? I hope you enjoyed this recorded lecture. Thank you for listening, and take what you learned. This is foundational to the rest of our pediatrics lectures. Have a good day, or night, or morning. Bye.